Big welcome to this Faith and Corona special. Hope you're doing well. I missed you last week. Sorry, got busy. Interestingly, Sunday, I was feeling a bit stressed and I remembered we did two broadcasts, one with Cara Lorman, one with Lynn Jones, on handling stress. So I went back to find those to get the 4 steps, and I'll put the links in the YouTube comments box under the YouTube video right here. But when I was looking at them, I was reminded it was a year ago, right in the early stages of UK lockdown. I think it was about broadcast 15, something like that. And we began to do our stand firm, look up, reach out, give thanks, make a difference. And on that day, as I listened to it, we were praying. We were praying that God would give us manufacturers in the UK, USA, and around the world that would enable us to manufacture enough ventilators. Do you remember that? How bad that was. Donald Trump called Boris up and made a big deal of the fact Boris said, we need ventilators. We prayed into that together just over a year ago. Can you believe that? And then it was the day that we all put some prayer welly into praying to God to bring about a vaccine that would end this wicked disease and help us see the light at the end of the tunnel. And here we are a year later. My wife right now is off vaccinating people. Our guest today, Sheridan Voysey, his wife Marin, is part of the Oxford AstraZeneca team. She's been responsible for a statistical analysis, amongst other things, answering prayers that we prayed together over a year ago. Over half the UK population jabbed. I've had mine, Jill's had hers. The family have had theirs. We're grateful. We're blessed. What great answers to prayers. Now, I wanted to show you this, and I wanted to remind you of this. Tracy Spires, taking a leaf out of the good book. If you didn't get a copy, tracyspires.com, and it's just wonderful. Many of you are doing Lent studies. This is a great little one a day for Lent. It takes about 90 seconds to read in the morning with your cuppa. I make Mrs. O a cuppa, and we always read this, or I say always, most days we read this. Let me read you this one. Okay, this is day 44. There are days when our doubts and negative whispers are louder than what we know in our hearts to be true. To be totally honest, I struggle at times to believe I will get work again in this uncertain season. Yesterday was one of those days, yet despite how I felt, I chose to hang on to the one I believe holds me in my future, and believe he is still good. Just because we can't see activity doesn't mean nothing is happening. Allotments are getting dug, ready for new seeds. A lot of growth happens in the dark before the shoots start to appear. Faith is about believing in what we cannot yet see. Many of you watching this may have lost your work, or work has changed, but we can still have purpose. We only have to look at creation. It goes on creating. I want to encourage you, says Tracy, to be creative and try something new. But, she says, it's also okay not to be okay at times. Some days we may only have the strength to hang on with the tips of our fingers. But hang on we must. This too will pass. Saturday and Sunday were hanging on days for me. It's okay not to be okay. Now, my second discovery, tracyspires.com, by the way, for that book. This book I'm going to recommend. If you haven't already seen it, it's called The Passion Translation. Now, my good friend Mike Beaumont challenges the translation title. He says it's really a paraphrase. I think he's right, but it's more translation than some paraphrases, less translation than some translations. But I love the poetry. It's poetry on fire from the book of Psalms. What psalm springs to mind when I say Psalms? 23. Correct. I haven't even read this yet, my first time. Here it goes. Yahweh is my best friend and my shepherd. I always have more than enough. He offers a resting place for me in his luxurious love. His tracks take me near to an oasis of peace. near the quiet brook of bliss. That's where he restores and revives my life. He opens before me the right path and leads me along in his footsteps of righteousness, so that I can bring honor to his name. Even when your path takes me through the valley of deepest darkness, fear will never conquer me, for you already have. Your authority is my strength and my peace. The comfort of your love takes away my fear. I will never be lonely. Can I read that again? I will never be lonely. Why? For you are near. Verse 5, you become my delicious feast. Even when my enemies dare to fight, you anoint me with the fragrance of your Holy Spirit. You give me all I can drink of you until my cup overflows. So why would I fear the future? Only goodness and tender love pursue me all the days of my life. Then, afterward, when my life is through, I'll return to your glorious presence to be forever with you. Passion Translation. Check it out. Now, about to take you into the interview. Well, a big welcome again to Sheridan Voysey. Many of you will have seen the last interview we did together. How to Recycle Adversity was my slightly vulgarized title for it, but it was a great interview, and lots of you I know benefited from it. You wrote in or you left comments. And it's good to have Sheridan again on something that I think is going to be very helpful. Before we go into the interview, you'll remember, of course, Sheridan is a broadcaster, does a weekly slot, the God slot, as it's called, here in the UK on Radio 2, isn't it, Sheridan? Radio
Yeah,
2.
I would love to be on every single week, but generally you kind of get a run of weeks, like every Monday for 4 or 5 weeks or something, then a bit of a break, then you come back. So,
Okay,
but yeah, regularly on the Zoe Ball Breakfast Show on Radio 2.
wonderful. And Sheridan's also a prolific author. I'm going to put up on screen just now two of the more recent books, Resurrection Year and The Making of Us, Who We Can Become When Life Doesn't Go as Planned. You'll see them up on screen, and you can see them on SheridanVoysey.com, or you can go to Amazon.com and purchase them there. I'll make sure we put those up again at the end of the broadcast. Now, confession time, folks. I work into quite a few churches in the US and in the UK, and I know firsthand the pain, particularly in America, but also in Europe, over Christians making political comments based on facts that they probably got from YouTube or from Facebook or from Instagram or from social media. And just recently, we had a global flashpoint, a trigger point in this context, the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah Winfrey. Sheridan wrote something almost immediately afterwards, and as soon as I saw it, I thought, we've got to try and get Sheridan on this broadcast to unpack some of the things he's been seeing, sensing, and giving us some practical ways to approach this ourselves. I watched one church that I work with torn apart, half Republican, half Democrat, in the American election. And I don't point the finger. I'm too quick to make ignorant comments myself, thinking I know what I'm talking about. So, Sheridan, help us, because I know this is something that's exercised you, and you've got some, I think, some really practical, helpful insights. So, what was the trigger out of the Harry and Meghan interview?
Well, the trigger on that is that what we had was this globally viewed interview from Oprah. And suddenly we were being asked by tabloid media and by breakfast radio programs, not BBC Radio 2, I must say, but other breakfast programs, breakfast TV programs here in the UK and right around the world, to take sides. Who are you on? Who are you with? Are you Team Markle or are you Team Windsor? Which one are you on? The fact was that by that stage, we hadn't heard both sides of the story. And really, you could argue that we still haven't heard both sides of the story, even though the royal family put out a very, very brief statement in response to it. But we were basically being asked to make an opinion on something. And we really didn't have all the facts. And yet, for the rest of the day, I was listening very closely to talkback radio, to news radio. I was hearing activists who were absolutely adamant that this was proof that the royal family were racist. And then I was seeing in tabloid media and others that couldn't stand the possibility that the royal family would be criticized in any way, going the opposite way and basically piling on rubbish on Harry and Meghan for, airing dirty laundry from the family. And I think that's just problematic, but it's a sign, I think, of something much broader. In the very social media kind of saturated world that we live in, and I'm a big user of social media. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, I'm on all of those platforms. But we know that the algorithms are discipling us. We know that they are shaping us. We know that the more we comment, the more traction we get with our comments, that reinforces in a Pavlovian way some sense of which we feel valued, important, because people start liking our comments or sharing our comments, retweeting our comments. We also know that the more emotive our comments are, the more the algorithm gives us an audience. So if we're incredibly fearful, incredibly angry, or if we've got a big thing to celebrate, those are the tweets and comments and posts that get opened up to a bigger audience. And that again reinforces our psyche that the more we comment on something, then the kind of the more reinforcement we get for our opinions. All of
So,
that plays into this. And so sometimes, we are talking about things we just don't know about, and it doesn't help the world, and I don't think it helps us.
so let me take you back to that Harry and Meghan interview and the days immediately surrounding that. Piers Morgan storms off set, some memorable moments. But I'm
Very.
I'm confident that people watching this right now will be wondering, well, what is a Christian response to something like that then? What should we try and do? What should we try not to do, and why? These are new times, aren't they? Social media is not totally new, but the scale of it, the intensity, the demand from it for us to give an opinion or to voice it. Help us through that a bit.
Yeah. Well, in the blog post that I originally wrote that you're referring to, which seems to have particularly resonated with Christian leaders, by the way, who are really trying to navigate this because sometimes they're being put in a position where they're required to have an opinion on all sorts of things that is kind of beyond their natural expertise, and so they have to have an opinion on the American political situation or um, the coronavirus conspiracies that are going around, or Harry and Meghan, or something else. Here's the good news, people. You don't need to have an opinion on everything. It's good for us to have opinions. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have opinions on everything or anything. We actually should have opinions on things that matter. But actually, it takes time to form an informed opinion. That's what's required, an informed opinion. And that means by nature, you're not going to be able to have an opinion on everything. It just takes too much work. So in the blog post, I talk about two fallacies: the fallacy of omniscience and the fallacy of omnicompetence. And the fallacy of omniscience, and you might know that word in relationship to God, omniscience, omni, all, science, knowledge. This idea that we have all knowledge, we have all the facts, and therefore we can go and comment. Now, let's go back to Harry and Meghan. We didn't have all the facts. We heard one side of the story. And so I think whenever we do that, whenever we hear one side of the story, we need to pause as Christians. If we are to follow the one who is the truth, who came full of truth and grace, if we are to be people of truth, then we have to hold our tongue. We have to be quick to listen, slow to speak. And that means we don't form an opinion quickly. In particular, do we need to have an opinion on this? Now, if racism is involved, well, then yes, okay, we want to be part of the answer to that in society. But ultimately, in this case, it's actually something for the royal family to deal with. We can do our bit to fight racism in our own spheres, our own little kingdoms of influence, our own circles where we live and work. But the idea that we know it all is a real problem, and I think maybe it's also being fed into us by the modern media landscape. We now can get information from the furthest reaches of the world where previous generations never had that. sometimes maybe it just gives us this idea, well, maybe I do know it all. Now, we've talked before about my wife's role in the coronavirus vaccine, in the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Uh, Maybe because of her role, I seem to get so many Christians normally sending me all sorts of conspiracy theories about the vaccine. And again, what's happened is we've kind of fallen into this fallacy of omniscience that somehow I've read a few anti vax bloggers here and there, and I somehow now I've awakened, I'm woke to this particular situation. And I know that actually there's all sorts of terrible ethical issues involved in it and terrible um, conspiracy around it. And Bill Gates is actually doing it to try and wipe out the global colored population and all of these things. And this is all playing into it. We don't have those facts. So I have to, in my role, when I get those, point people back to sources of confirmed, authoritative, and accountable information. So that's just one of those 2 points is the
While you've
fallacy
been
of omniscience.
talking there, that's really helpful, by the way. First of 2 points, folks, the fallacy of omniscience. By the way, we'll make the blog available. You'll see it up on screen in just a moment, and I'll put the link in the channel notes just below this video showing now. But it reminded me, Sheridan, of that scripture, and it goes back to the Old Testament. I'll paraphrase it rather crudely, but essentially the scripture says, the first person to present a case seems right until you get to hear the second person. And the whole emphasis there is about source and both. It's hearing it, whatever it is, from both sides of a story or a concern or an accusation, and then making sure you clearly have the source. And I think that's partly what you're saying here. So easy to pontificate based on sources we've picked up from emails, from blogs, from Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and the like. Actually, let's make sure we know the sources. So tell us then about the second fallacy, Sheridan.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. You're talking about sources. And also, I would also point people just on what you've just talked about there to the first few verses of the Gospel of Luke. You know, in the time of the first century, all sorts of stories were floating around about Jesus. And some of them were completely erroneous. Some of them were conspiracy theories. Some of them were completely fake news. And he then says, look, I've gone into this. I'm going to go and give I'm going to become an investigative journalist. I'm going to find out what the real facts are, and I present them to you now. And what does Luke do? He presents names, he presents historical references, everything that can be traced back and tied back and kind of tested. And that's what we're to do in these kinds of things. The fallacy of omnicompetence is to suggest that we are all competent, that we suddenly are able to then have authority to speak into areas that we're not trained in. And again, to use the coronavirus situation, I see this happening all the time. So if you go to that blog post, you'll see 2 things actually. One, you'll see that I had a little tussle with somebody on Facebook at one stage. I'm pulling one incident out of many, by the way, but I had this one little conversation with this guy who made all sorts of completely erroneous claims about COVID vaccines. One being that there was no research done into their effectiveness. And I said, well, actually, all the research that's been done has been done on their effectiveness, including my wife's own defining paper on it, published in The Lancet, one of the most highly regarded medical journals in the world. So I posted that link so he could have a read of it. And then he proceeded to pick it apart for its scientific weaknesses. Now, was this man a vaccinologist? Was he a biostatistician? He was a church pastor. But somehow he thought that he was authoritative to pick apart what had been a peer reviewed piece of long term, 10-month long research into the effectiveness of this vaccine within all sorts of scientific boundaries. And of course, as he was picking it apart, it was kind of embarrassing because he was actually showing he knew nothing about what he was actually talking about. Now, if you go to the comments of that blog post, a similar conversation has opened up with somebody else. Here's the problem. I think that we should have informed opinions about vaccines. There are ethical issues for us to weigh when it comes to vaccines, absolutely. But we can't then, as Christian leaders, Christian pastors who aren't scientists, we can't then step into that and say, well, I suddenly have the authority to pick apart a scientific paper. And look, we can do this on all sorts of things. I've had to hold myself back on talking about American politics, for example, because some of the things I was seeing happening over the last 6 years or so over in the United States got me really quite concerned, and particularly the Christian community's involvement in that. And then I had to go, hang on a sec, Sheridan, you're not American. You're Australian, 10 years in the UK, you don't live in the country, and while you read up quite significantly about American politics and the church's involvement in politics, you're still not there. Hold back, speak into those things that you might have some kind of credibility in, like the media, like the way that media has been used, like conspiracy theories and QAnon and all of those kinds of things and how they've infiltrated. You have something authoritative to say into that, but you don't about a whole heap of other policies and things. Step back. This is not your field.
So this is helpful, but I also think this is liberating, Sheridan. I'd not thought about it quite as succinctly or as sharply focused as you've just described it for church leaders. I know the pressure on church leaders, pressure on me. So I'm a prophetic person. Pressure on me to come up with answers to the prophetic into COVID. And actually, I don't have them. And I know most church leaders have this pressure, whether it's perceived reality or a mix of both, I don't know. But we have to come up with a view on everything. This is liberating. We really don't.
Right.
So, how this, of course, is not a church leaders channel. Many who watch it are church leaders. But just for a moment, let's help church leaders here. Do you have some thoughts around, well, what should I really have an opinion on then? And where are the things where I can step back and encourage my flock? Or is it just something I've got to ask God for myself and make a judgment? Help us out there.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, ultimately, if it's starting to really affect your people, I think then there would be a biblical call for you to, step in, research those kinds of things well. Um, but also, just what you've said there, Dave, is that is the mark of integrity to me. Is that if you are called and gifted in to be a prophetic voice, and yet sometimes the Lord doesn't give you something on something, well, then you hold back. And I will place a lot more credibility on you if you actually say that. And of course, we had a great challenge recently in the kind of American prophetic world when we had a lot of prophetic voices get the election result completely wrong. And only one or two of those people to date, I may be wrong on that, have apologized for getting it wrong. The rest kind of doubled down. And that's caused all sorts of credibility issues. I would much rather hear from somebody who says, I just don't know. And it is liberating. Then we can step back. So I think if it's really going to affect your people, you need to get involved in it. Um, something like, just for instance, we talked about this on our last interview, but when Marin, my wife, and I were going through the early stages of trying to work out, say, the ethics of IVF because of our infertility journey, it was very difficult because we found that the responses from the people around us tended to be one of two dominant responses. One was, oh, look, if you can't fall pregnant naturally, then you shouldn't do anything else. You really shouldn't play around with anything that uses technology or anything like that, because you just need to go with what God does. Almost a fatalistic approach. But the other approach was, don't worry about the ethics. Leave that to God. Just go and do whatever it takes to have a child. It would have been really helpful if we had had, say, somebody in church leadership at the time who had actually kind of waded into the ethics of IVF with us. We were left alone to do that. Now, I don't blame our pastor at the time because, I know the pressure on pastors and everything else. But I remember somebody saying that to me. Gosh, wouldn't it have been nice if, you'd had a pastor or something kind of walk along the journey with you, The fact is, by the way, pastors, if you're listening, if you do that, it's not going to be time wasted anyway, because I bet you there's actually already quite a few people sitting in your pews who are wrestling with this, or their family members are wrestling with this, so it won't be wasted time. That would have been really helpful because we were left alone with that. So I think that can be a helpful time. So I think when it affects your people in some kind of way, I think that's the key. I think what we should do is try to not preach to the social media audience. And again, I'm finding myself pulling myself back on that too, is saying, hang on, who needs my opinion on this? Is it the people closest to me? Is it the people in one particular area that I get to speak into? Or is it in a public setting like the world? Here's the other problem that's happening a little bit in Christian circles when it comes to all the conspiracy theories going on around vaccines, is that there's so much confusion because there's various different countries focusing on various different vaccines, and they have various different methods of assessing the effectiveness of those different vaccines. And what's happening is some people are kind of pulling the results out of here, applying it to a different country with a different vaccine with a completely different methodology, all because we have this kind of worldwide platform now with our social media platforms. So I don't know if that helps, but that would be the
It's
summary.
really helpful. I think even there, taking your IVF example, um, I wouldn't have a clear view myself. But I tell you exactly where I'd go, and this might just help those of you who are church leaders. Remember, we're talking about the fallacy of omnicompetence, where you yourself are supposed to have a view on everything. Sheridan's helped us by saying, look, if it really affects the flock, then you've got a responsibility. But actually, on an issue like IVF, I would go straight to the Christian Medical Fellowship and I would draw down the wisdom from people who really have walked it through and who know it. In the Salt and Light family of churches, which many of you watching are part of, I'd go to Mike Beaumont, Steve Jones, who have wrestled through issues like this. So there are resources both within our Salt and Light family, but of course, many of you not in that family, plenty of resources around, including Christian Medical Fellowship here in the UK and US, and equivalents in Europe and beyond. Sheridan, before we go, tell us about the making of us.
Well, The Making of Us is a book that I wrote. It took, oh gosh, about 6 years of reflection and research and about 2 years of writing to answer the question, who can we become when life doesn't go as planned? So it came out of my own experience, Marin and myself not being able to become parents, but then moving from Sydney to Oxford, starting again, leaving broadcasting behind in Australia, coming here as a nobody, um, publishers turning me down, and all the things that I'd built my life on, then suddenly the doors seemed to be closed on them. So who can you become when life doesn't go as planned? And it's built around a pilgrimage that a friend and I did a few years ago from Lindisfarne Island to Durham, and all the conversations we have and all the kind of stories that we have of some of the great Christian leaders that really transformed that region back in the 7th and 8th centuries, Cuthbert and Bede and all those wonderful church leaders in the past, Hilda, um, and coming up with the idea actually that when life doesn't go as planned, when you don't get the dream come true, when things go wrong, you lose the career, don't get the wife, don't get the husband, don't get the children, whatever it might be that you've really wanted and you don't get, or you lose, that actually in the hands of God can be the very time that you become the person you're meant to be. When you lose an identity, that's when you can discover who you really are. When you have the dream lost, the adversity you face can actually be the very thing God uses to bring your best contribution into the world. So, in short, life not going to plan can, in the hands of God, be the making of you. That's really the message of the book.
Very good. And we can get that from Amazon. Can we get it direct from your website or do we get it from Amazon?
You can get it from my website. Yes, you can get it from you can go to your local shop and order it if you don't have it. Local Christian bookstores would love your business right now, so go and order it through them. Otherwise, Book Depository, Amazon, all of those places have it.
Very good. We'll put that book cover up on screen, and I'd encourage you to read it. Kjell Toftes, one of our regular viewers, a pastor in Sweden, bought 4 copies and told Sheridan and me that he was so impacted by the story that he preached it in his church near Östervöla in Sweden the week after the broadcast. So maybe a few teaching tips there for you church leaders and pastors. Sheridan, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Dave. Thanks again.